This is the Aunty and Brain Tumours talk show. It's a show full of informative chat and inspirational messages. The Aunty and Brain Tumours talk show on podcast.
Hi, I'm Madi, and I was diagnosed with oligodendroglioma grade 2. My story begins back in 2018 when I experienced my first seizure. After my first seizure, doctors weren't that concerned, but after I had a second seizure within a 12-month period, they decided that it was time to do an MRI and some further testing. After they performed the MRI, they discovered that I had a mass in my brain, and they weren't sure what it was, but they determined that it was likely the cause of my seizures. Immediately after that, I started on Keppra to try and control the seizures. And after those first two initial seizures, I've only had two since. I had my first MRI. I was living in St. John's, Newfoundland, and I continued to live in St. John's, Newfoundland for about 2 years after that. And in those 2 years, I had the same neurologist, and we didn't really make any progress on the diagnosis. They were most concerned about just controlling the seizures, and I really didn't have any other symptoms. So the tumor, it was growing very, very slowly to the point where, they noticed it, but it wasn't a point of concern. So we just continued to manage my seizures with Keppra. In 2020, in July 2020, I moved from Newfoundland to British Columbia. And of course, after moving across the country, I then needed to get a new neurologist. I proceeded to have another seizure. I believe it was in April of 2021. And this was the first time I had had a seizure since moving to British Columbia. And it was really the first time that my neurologist here in British Columbia really ran any tests. So after that seizure, we did EEGs, we did regular MRIs, and we were really monitoring the growth and the size of the tumor. But even though my doctors weren't concerned about getting a definitive diagnosis, it was something that I was really concerned about. Throughout the whole process, I had had a lot of, it could be this, it could be that, from not only my neurologists, but also from my family doctors. And there was really no referrals to any specialists. There was no options made available to me as far as what I could do as far as diagnosis. And I really didn't know what the next step was, but I knew that this is something that was in my brain that shouldn't be in my brain. And I definitely wanted to know what it was. And I definitely wanted to know if it was causing my seizures or if there were other issues that needed to be addressed. So since moving to British Columbia, I believe I'm on my third neurologist. So that would be, in total, I've had 4 or 5 neurologists, and each one kept referring me to a different one because I kept asking. I kept asking what this was. I kept asking what it could be. I just felt like I needed to know. It was something that isn't supposed to be there. And I wanted to know if it was something that was going to affect me for the rest of my life. I wanted to know if there was going to be possible future implication on my health or otherwise. I'm now currently on my 4th or 5th neurologist, and he was really the only one who considered referring to other specialists and consulting with other specialists. And he did a lot of that behind the scenes without me involved. He had consulted with other professionals to get their opinions on what they thought this could be. And when I told him that I really wanted to know what this was. He took it seriously, and he was the first doctor of any kind that actually offered me the option of a biopsy. So the option for a biopsy was presented to me by my neurologist, I believe in November of 2023. And that was when we had set up an appointment, a consultation with the neurosurgeon who really assessed the location of my tumor and reviewed all my previous imaging, all my previous tests, and really assessed if a biopsy would be beneficial. When he reviewed all of my 6 years of imaging history for him to refer to, he could really see that this tumor was slow growing. The total circumference, I believe, was about 19 millimeters, and it had only grown approximately 1.9 millimeters in those 6 years. So it was concerning that it was growing, but it wasn't pressing for it to be addressed. But considering I had gone through this process for 6 years at this point, I opted to do a biopsy. And the biopsy was scheduled for July 30th of 2024. My tumor is located, part of it is in the parietal lobe, and part of it is migrating into my occipital lobe. And to prevent the possibility of vision loss, the part of the tumor that was extracted during the biopsy was at a point that was relatively far away from the occipital lobe, because vision loss was, at the time, it wasn't as big of a concern of mine, because I think I was just really focused on getting a diagnosis. And a lot of the conversations I had with my neurosurgeon, I didn't write down any information, and I didn't really remember the information that he was telling me. So um, I had the biopsy on July 30th, 2024. I was in the hospital for about 2 days. While I was still in the hospital, I noticed that when I was up and walking around, my vision seemed wonky, and I couldn't quite describe it to the physical therapist and the occupational therapist. I couldn't quite pinpoint what was wrong with my vision, but something wasn't quite right, and my balance seemed to be okay. But again, there was just something that I couldn't quite pinpoint. And in retrospect, I do believe that the issues that I was having with my vision, I do believe they progressed in the couple days following surgery, just as swelling increased from having my biopsy. But when the physical and occupational therapists were asking me if I was having any trouble, I couldn't quite describe what was happening, but something just felt off. So during the drive home from Vancouver, Vancouver is about a 14-hour drive from where I currently live in northeastern BC. And my dad was driving the entire time. My vision was still bothering me. Things didn't feel quite right. I did have a little bit of discomfort in my head from the surgery. If I had to put it on a scale, it was probably about a 3 or 4 out of 10. It essentially just felt like a sore spot on my head. But I was really, really irritable because my vision, it just didn't make sense. And I didn't remember ever discussing complications that could come from the surgery that would affect my vision. So we drove home. It was a 14 or 15-hour drive home. And we spread that out. We spread that out over 2 days just to make it a little bit more comfortable for both myself and my father. And once I got home is really when I was able to sit back and really analyze the complications that I was having and the issues with my vision. There was about 30% of the vision in my left eye where I just couldn't see anything. And in your peripherals, you can kind of see your shoulders. And on my left side, I couldn't see anything past about here. And I honestly thought I was going crazy when it happened. Uh, and I felt like there was no way that this could have happened. I didn't remember ever discussing it with my neurosurgeon. Motion sickness got really, really bad. Just walking from my couch into my bedroom, which is maybe 50 feet, I started to get really queasy and get an upset stomach. My depth perception was completely off. I would pick up a cup of tea and I would go to try and put it on the counter or on a table, and I would miss the table completely. Was nowhere near it. My steps, it felt like the ground was a mile away when I was trying to walk. And that was when I called my neurosurgeon's office and I told them something isn't quite right. And I believe we waited about 5 days. I believe I called him on day 2 after getting home, so about 4 days after surgery. And we waited another 4 or 5. I believe it was day 8 or day 9 when I called him again and I was like, hey, this isn't getting better. I still have about 30% of the vision in my left eye that is gone. Motion sickness is still very much a thing. Depth perception is wonky, and I'm starting to worry. And so he sent me to my optometrist, who then did visual field tests, and it was confirmed that not only was there approximately 30% of the vision gone in my left eye, but there was actually a significant blind spot in my right eye as well. But because it wasn't as big, my brain was almost ignoring it and only focusing on the visual deficits in my left eye. So my optometrist then referred me to a neuro-ophthalmologist, and it took a while to hear back from her. But overall, the symptoms, the side effects of my surgery regarding my vision, they subsided. I think it was after about day 12 after my surgery, where they really started to subside. And I woke up and there were still some visual deficits, but it was less. My motion sickness was getting a little bit better. I could be in the car and be moving and not feel queasy. And the depth perception took a little bit longer to come back, but overall I noticed some improvement, and slowly day by day things really started to come back to me and things started to feel a little bit more normal. As far as the healing of my incision, I got really, really lucky and the surgeons were able to patch me up. I was really concerned that I was going to lose all of my hair. And my surgeons were actually very considerate that my hair was important to me. And they shaved the minimum amount that they absolutely had to. And my incision is located at the back of my head. And so they made it so that my 2 shaved strips, one for the incision, and I believe the other one might have been for monitoring. I was never told about that one, but they really made it so that the rest of my hair could cover the shaved areas relatively well. So again, it seemed very, very silly, and it seems silly in hindsight, but it was a concern for me. So after the first visual field test from my optometrist, we did another visual field test, and it confirmed that the visual deficits had decreased significantly. When I had the approximately 30% vision loss, I actually wasn't able to legally drive because my field of vision, what's required here in Canada is that you have 120 degrees of, I don't know the proper terminology, but you have to have a 120 degrees of vision on your horizontal plane. And I didn't because of this visual deficit. So I believe it was about 10 days after the first visual field test that we performed another one, and it had improved enough that I was actually cleared to drive. After those 10 days, it took a little bit longer for everything to come back 100%, but eventually it did. Any other aspects of my life except for my seizures, which are managed. So I was really scared that I had just made one of the worst mistakes of my life and had gotten this biopsy because I was determined to figure out what this was in my brain without researching the whole picture, without researching the possibilities of what could happen, without looking into other options, and if it really would have been best for me to just leave it, or if I really did want to get the biopsy. So the plan going forward, my surgeon called me and we had a really in-depth conversation about what the next steps were. And at that given time, he had listed out my options, and which were chemo radiation, a drug trial that had just finished. I believe it's vorasidenib. There was the watch and wait approach, resection, which we wouldn't be able to do a complete resection because I'm not willing to risk losing 50% of my vision by removing the portion of the tumor that is in my occipital lobe. So we would do about an 80% resection. And he really laid it out on the table, and he told me that if you're going to have a brain tumor, this is the one to have. And he acknowledged that obviously the ideal is to not have a brain tumor, but oligodendroglioma grade 2 typically responds really well to treatment. And there are a significant amount of stories where patients have lived a full life. They've lived for 20, 30, 40 years. And many of those years, if not all, are relatively good quality. They may not be the same as before your surgery because brain surgery is no joke, but you can maintain a good quality of life. He did tell me that I was being referred to a neuro-oncologist. He told me that I would be contacted by the British Columbia Cancer um, Association, and they would be able to provide me further information. They would be able to provide me with any support that I need, because after diagnosis, I very much took on a research role, and I started Googling and Googling and Googling, and I did not stop for weeks. Before I returned to work, I was Googling, probably about, I want to say 4 to 6 hours a day. I was on there reading medical studies. I was reading different stories. I was reading up on BC Cancer. I was reading up on my doctors and their reviews online. And I really took on a research role. And I really wanted to know what information was behind the name. And I really wanted to know what was oligodendroglioma? What was it doing? What causes it? Is there anything that I can do to prevent further growth? One of the things that my neurosurgeon had mentioned to me at one point in time or another was demyelination. And so I was looking up oligodendroglioma and demyelination, and I really had to teach myself all these different medical terms. And in medical journals, there's a lot of abbreviations, and I had to teach myself those because you really can't read a medical journal from start to finish unless you know what these abbreviations mean, because there's so many of them, it doesn't make sense. So for me, there was a lot of research. And during that research, there was a couple points in time where I created a lot of panic in myself because I was reading that the median lifespan was first I read that it was 12 years, and that sent me. That created so much panic in me because I am 27 years old, and the thought of not living to see my 40th birthday, and I just couldn't accept that I had already lived longer than the time I possibly had left. And there's so many things in life that I wanted to do. I want to get married. I want to have kids. I want to own a home. I want to travel. And I just thought to myself, there's no way that I can accomplish everything I want to accomplish in 12 years. And then I kept researching, and then that 12 years turned into 15 years. And then that 15 years turned into 17 years. And then on top of the research that I was doing, my counselor had suggested that I look for support groups. And support groups work for some people and they don't work for others. And one of the hard things about support groups is that everyone's journey is different, but everyone is experiencing a lot of similar things, especially when you're looking at support groups that are specific to a type of tumor. So all these people have the same tumor as you. And on one hand, it really makes you feel like you're not alone. It really makes you feel like you have a community. But on the other hand, people like myself, I really approach it as you got to do what's best for you. And if that means that, if that means you don't quit drinking, if that means you don't quit smoking, if that means that you're still working 100 hours a week, if you're not, if that's what's getting you from one day to the next, then do it, because you're going to have your good days and you're going to have your bad days. But at the end of the day, you just got to make it through that 24 hours. And once you live that 24 hours, you never have to live that 24 hours again. Doesn't matter if it was the worst day of your life, you never have to live those 24 hours again. And that's the approach that I have, is you need to do what you need to do to get yourself through that 24 hours. On the other hand, you have some patients who drop everything and really go on this health and healing journey. And they drop any bad habits. They drop any, I don't know, processed food. Some of them take on a holistic approach because that's what works for them. But the struggle with being in a support group with all these different people, with all these different opinions, sometimes when you voice your opinions, there is going to be pushback. So that was one thing that I really struggled with when I first joined these support groups, is that nobody's approach is wrong. Everyone can approach it in a different way, and that's okay. But there are going to be people in these support groups who aren't okay with people taking on a different approach. There's going to be people who approach their journey the same way that you do, and you may find camaraderie in those people. But there will be people that have differing opinions, and it just is what it is. But one thing in particular that these support groups help me realize is that the median lifespan that is being talked about in all these different medical journals and all these different papers and all these different studies, they don't give you a clear picture of the whole picture. And I don't want to say that the numbers lie, but it gives you a false sense of urgency that you really don't have that much time. But after joining these support groups, it really made me realize that there's people who have lived with this type of tumor for 40 years. And there's people who were diagnosed at a younger age than I am who are now in their 80s and 90s. And since diagnosis, they've had children, they've gotten married, they have bought homes, they've traveled, they've excelled in their careers. And it really helped me realize that 12 wasn't a given. And I essentially, the support groups made me realize that I didn't have an expiration date and there was nothing set in stone. And any advice that I could give to someone who is going through a diagnosis and is really scared, don't take everything you read in medical journals at face value. Joining these support groups can really give you a better idea of what you can expect moving forward.
This is the Aunty and Brain Tumours talk show. It's a show full of informative chat and inspirational messages. The Aunty and Brain Tumours talk show on podcast.